Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall. Hey, Chris, it's Christmas time, so I just wanted to, before we start the show, just wish you a Merry Christmas. So, Merry Christmas, Chris.
Christmas time to you, but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I could work my wills, Randall, every idiot who goes with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with the stake of holly through his heart.
Wow, that you sounded like Ebenezer Scrooge right there from A Christmas
Well,
Carol.
that's because it is Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. Welcome, everybody, to the Christmas episodes, or the winter holiday episodes of Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall, our two-parter on Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Part one should be airing December 17th, 3 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. And the second part will be airing December 24th, Christmas Eve, 3 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. This is a deep, deep dive into, without a doubt, a perennial holiday classic. Did you know, Randall, that since this book's been published in 1843, it has never gone out of print?
That's amazing.
It is. It's insane. In fact, I know that I can't imagine there's anyone who's not at least in. If you haven't read A Christmas Carol, then you've certainly watched a movie, a TV show, a special episode, a cartoon, something, right? I mean, we all here know A Christmas Carol. But before we go any further, here's my holiday plea to you. Do you know what I want as a gift this year, Randall?
What do you want?
I want people who are either watching this show or listening to this show to give me the gift of a like or a subscribe or a follow or a share or a comment, either on YouTube or Facebook, or I don't know, if people want to just wish us Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, where can they reach us? At the North Pole or online at where?
Just go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, and there's links there to everything.
Thank you. And again, God bless each and every one of you. And as you give us any kind of gift, like, or comment, it will be the best Christmas ever. So we're going to divide this show into two parts. The first part is dealing with the book, A Christmas Carol. And the second episode will be dealing with all the adaptations of A Christmas Carol and its cultural impact. Let's set up the history for this book. It's really interesting. We tend to think that Christmas has been around forever because it celebrates the birth of the Lord. But as an actual activity, a holiday, it really does not come into fashion until the early 1800s in England, with the introduction of Christmas trees and the revival of singing carols. In 1823, we see the ancient Christmas carols get revived. They come out of West England. By 1833, Christmas carols, ancient and modern, are published. This is the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria. Her husband, Prince Albert from Germany, is the person who brought Christmas trees to England and made it part of the Christmas experience. What other amazing and very significant thing is going on in England at this time, Randall?
Well, yeah, you covered a lot of it. The Christmas season has been celebrated for a long time. It goes way back to the Roman Empire, but sometime around the 1750s in England, the Industrial Revolution starts, and by the early part of the 1800s, there's this fad in Victorian England to go back to ancient traditions. And of course, when they go back to the ancient Christmas tradition, they make up a lot of it. So that's, like you said, that's where we get Christmas trees and such, and Christmas carols. Christmas carols start getting renewed interest. So yeah, like you said, in 1823 and 1833, some major Christmas carol books were published.
There is the Oxford movement in the Anglican Church, where priests are now doing mission work in poorer communities and trying to bring more of the traditional Catholic liturgy into the Anglican Church. And at the same time, it's a very weird contrast, because in the beginning of the 19th century in England is the Industrial Revolution, and certainly by the midpoint, 1840s, it's in full swing. England has gone from being an agricultural society to being a society of cities and a society of machines and factories and rapid development. And in England, you start to see developments of merchant classes, working classes, wealth built on the ownership of factories.
Right, and with all of these big changes, the Victorians are looking backward to a simpler time and looking backward to simpler traditions.
And with it comes this greater disparity as we move into the middle point of the 19th century in England, especially in cities like London, of extreme wealth and extreme poverty. And I believe Frederick Ingalls was in England around this period of time.
Yeah, so Christmas Carol comes out in 1843, but in around 1844, Ingalls writes The Condition of the Working Class in England. It's not published in the English world till the late 1800s, but so the Christmas Carol and Ingalls' first book, which inspires Marx, they're written around the same time and about the same city. I mean, that's quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?
That is England of, it's an England of poverty. It's an England of child labor. It is soot and dirt, and there's a lot of things going on now.
People are literally starving on the street.
Right,
everywhere you look.
At this period in Dickens' own life, 1843, he's 31 years old. He's published several successful novels. He's actually what we'd call in the middle of his career. He's married. He's expecting another child. In 1842, he goes on a tour of the U.S. and he writes American notes for the general circulation. Now, what was his take on his trip to the United States?
Well, I think that many of his much of what he observed in America was similar to what you see in the Scrooge character. Maybe that's an overstatement.
We'll get to the story in a moment, but just in general, what's his take on America in the middle of the 19th century?
Well, he thinks Americans idolize successful businessmen, and we still do that.
Okay, so it's not as positive as he had hoped. And the following year, in February of 1843, the second report of the Children's Employment Commission is published. It was a parliamentary report exposing the effects of the Industrial Revolution upon working class children. Now, this is a subject near and dear to Scrooge because his father,
Dickens, you mean?
Dickens' father was terrible with money, landed in debtor's prison. When Dickens was a very small boy, he had to leave school and work in a factory himself to support his family. And he saw firsthand how horrific child labor was at the beginning of the 19th century. And if you look at all of his works, not just in the book we're going to talk about today, there's always a lot about the difficulty of being a child thrown into the working world. You know, children were tried as adults at this period in history. They could be hung for committing crimes. The concept of the child as we know it, modern child, is certainly, it exists in this period of Victorian England, but it is not. It's not a guarantee for everyone in this period. In fact, this is really the beginning of childhood as we know it in a middle class way. Wouldn't you say, Randall?
Yeah, childhood is invented somewhere in this time. by psychologists, sociologists, activists, people like Dickens.
So this is the time in 1843 where he's touring Cornish tin mines. He is angered by seeing children working in these appalling conditions. It's also the same year that he goes to the Field Lane Ragged School, one of several London schools set up for the education of the capital's half-starved, illiterate street children. And he does not like what he sees, does he?
Well, he's horrified, like most people would be. London is filled with Oliver Twistian street beggars, little kids, scamps whose families can't support them anymore, and so they do whatever they can to survive.
And at this point, in October of that same year, at Manchester and I can never say this word, Anathium, he gives a speech on the 5th of October urging workers and employers to join together to combat ignorance with educational reform. Now, at this very same time in his life, he's 31, he has 5 children, he has another child on the way. His last book, Martin Chuzzlewit, has not done very well in sales. It's starting to fall off. His publishers have threatened to reduce his monthly income further if sales drops. So he himself is in quite a bind. And at this point, he is almost at a crossroads because on one hand, he is thinking of writing a pamphlet entitled, I don't have it before me, unfortunately, but it is a pamphlet on the topic of child labor to raise the consciousness of people. But instead,
he knows that pamphlet wouldn't sell.
Well,
First,
he thought it's going to sell. Then he puts it off. Then he talks to other people like, Charles, this is not your strong suit. And having given that speech in October of 1843, it becomes very clear he is not going to motivate people to action by writing pamphlets. He has bills to pay and he has a cause to take. So in less than 6 weeks, in what many people call a great white heat, he writes A Christmas Carol. It's actually his 3rd Christmas story. He will write 4 more. It is published. It's a very interesting publishing deal where he doesn't really get paid. He's just going to collect a percentage on the back end. And that brings us to A Christmas Carol, illustrated by John Leach, which is, I think, very important because so much of the way we see in our heads is through those early illustrations. So in the preface to the book, Dickens writes, I have endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea, which shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, Charles Dickens. So now, I'm going to give the very briefest synopsis of A Christmas Carol. If you want, you can time me. So, Ebenezer Scrooge works in a counting house where his former partner, Jacob Marley, has passed away. He has a clerk named Bob Cratchit, and he has a nephew named Fred. He is terse and curt with both of them, turning down his nephew's invitation to have dinner with him on Christmas Day, begrudgingly giving Bob Cratchit the day off for Christmas. He is approached by a charity service to make a donation. He basically says, look, I pay taxes. I don't really think I need to give you more than that. At home by himself, he is visited by the ghost of his former partner, Jacob Marley, who is in chains because he himself has not walked with his fellow man, and warns them that he will have 3 visitations of 3 ghosts, and how this night goes will depend on his entire fate. He wakes up that night to the ghost of Christmas past, where we, the reader, learn that at one point he was a young man, a child who was very close to his sister Belle, abandoned and sent away to school, who then is rescued by Belle. He then works for the very kindly Mr. Fezziwig, a very generous employer. he falls in love with a woman. Sorry, it was Belle who he falls in love with. Fanny is his sister. He falls in love with a woman named Belle, who finally turns down their engagement because she says he loves money. The ghost then shows that Belle actually ended up getting married and having kids, something he never had. Scrooge is so upset he wants to be taken back to the present day, whereupon he meets the ghost of Christmas Present, a man who looks basically like Santa Claus in his large girth, who takes him to the house of Bob Cratchit, where he finds that Cratchit lives in a poor hovel where he has a son named Tiny Tim, who is a very innocent cripple who the ghost of Christmas Present tells him will die. And unless it looks like he might die in the future. And that makes Ebenezer feel very hard and sad. And then he takes him, of course, to see his nephew, who is polite, but also everyone in their party makes fun of Scrooge as a nasty old miser. And then he sees that people are celebrating Christmas with friends and family and coworkers throughout the world. And then he is brought back, finally, and he sees a Christmas of yet to be, where he sees that his colleagues are speaking ill of a man who just died, and there may or may not be his own corpse lying on a bed. And he finds out that the maid, the undertaker, and one other domestic have robbed the man of his basics and have sold it. He asks to see some kindness, and all he ends up finding is that, in fact, the Cratchits are devastated, as Tiny Tim has passed away. Then he is taken to his own grave, where he sees his own final fate. He wakes up. It is Christmas Day. He realizes he has a second chance to be a better man. So he treats Bob Cratchit to a lovely large Christmas turkey, but gives it anonymously. He gives money and tips to just about everyone that day. He has dinner with his cousin, Fred. And then the following day, when Bob Cratchit does come late for work, instead of firing him, he doubles his salary, and then we find out later on, becomes as good a patron to Tiny Tim, who lives as almost a second father, and he is beloved throughout the land. How long did that take?
I didn't time you, but about 5 minutes, hopefully. I
Oh,
think.
God. Well, anyway, that is the world. You're supposed to say that was only 2 minutes, Chris. That was my fastest attempt at giving you the briefest synopsis. And I know every one of you has actually seen it. So why did I do this? For the 3 people who've never actually read the book and have only seen the movie, because I do believe that having seen movies, we tend to forget what the actual story is about. So, Randall, what is this story about? What is going on in A Christmas Carol?
Well, I think at its very basic level, it's about a man, an old man who's lost his humanity. He's given up on relationships with other people. He's pushed them away, and the story is about him reclaiming his humanity.
Okay, well, I mean, it's an interesting thing in that it is a ghost story, something that Dickens has written before. It is social criticism, something that Dickens has written before. It's weird in that it follows on one hand the Aristotelian unities, because it takes place over the course of one evening, one 24-hour period, one evening to the next. And at the same time, like a great Buildings roman or novel, it covers the expanse of a man's entire life from childhood to the grave. It is fascinating in the dexterity. But a more basic question I have for you is, do you think Scrooge is a hero, a villain, an anti-hero?
Well, I think he starts out as an anti-hero, in that I'm sure a lot of people secretly love how he hates Christmas, and then but he's also just an everyman. There's nothing. I think the way Dickens writes him.
That's a good point, because before you go further, there's a really great illustration of your point. Very early on, when Bob Cratchit asks him about, can I have the day off for for Christmas. Actually, it's not even that. Scrooge just says, you'll be expecting for me to give you a day's pay for Christmas. And Bob Cratchit says, Mr. Scrooge, it only comes once a year. And he says, a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here the earlier the next morning. So you are right? I mean, as an everyman, he's begrudging, but for years I actually used to think that, as a child, that the reason why Scrooge is a bad man is he doesn't give Bob Cratchit the day off.
Well, I think this is one of the more interesting parts about this story. It's not that Scrooge is doing anything bad to other people. It's that he's hurting himself. He needs to change so that he needs to change for himself. I mean, this story, it's very insular. It's very much about just one person, this story. I mean, there's a lot of stories that are about, that's why he's not a hero in the story. Well, you would argue he's a hero, but
Well, I mean, you could argue he starts out, as you say, as an anti-hero. You could say, and I think there is a debate whether or not he's an everyman or whether or not he is a businessman, and somehow a businessman more than a man, and there is that thing. I mean, people always say, well, what did he do wrong? What is he being punished for? What is the sin of Scrooge? And if it's not that he doesn't give the man Christmas Day off, then I think it's really in that wonderful moment where the ghost of Jacob Marley tells him at the very beginning in Stav 1. I love how he uses musical notations as opposed to chapters. Marley, it's required of every man, the ghost returned, that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned into happiness. Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. So
yeah, I just want to add that there's a little scene that not every adaptation has, where after the ghost leaves, Scrooge looks out the window and he sees all these other ghosts, and they're all trying to help people, but they can't anymore because now they're ghosts and their life has passed and they regret it.
Exactly. So the thing that Scrooge has up to this point done is he has not walked abroad among his fellow men. He has not shared. He is not connected. He does not have empathy. He does not have sympathy. He does not consider himself part of humanity, part of the collective society. And as we just said, it's a trap of his own making. No one has foisted this upon himself. He has foisted it upon himself, and he is heading in this direction, right? Because that's what he's saying, that your life is heading in this direction. Now tonight really is your last shot. And it's interesting because this is not even the first time Dickens has written this story. Back in 1836, he wrote a story called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. A sexton was a man who worked at a church, often a graveyard digger, but someone who just looked after the church. I'm sorry, that was an earlier story he wrote. And in that, and it's relayed again in the 1836 novel, The Pickwick Papers. In that episode, Mr. Wardell relates the tale of Gabriel Grubb. It almost sounds like Scrooge, doesn't it? Gabriel Grubb, a lonely, mean-spirited sexton who undergoes a Christmas conversion after being visited by goblins who show him the past and the future. So, yeah, he has been tinkering around with this idea before anything that has come out in the 1840s, before his own financial needs. This is as any writer has. Have you ever worked on a project where there's a rough draft, it never really comes to fruition, and then you finally find the right meeting point in it? And just the very fact that, there's the past and the future, there are demons that haunt us. We'll get into that later, but on a base level, how does this story work as entertainment, would you say, Randall?
Well, the story is full of spectacle. There's 3 supernatural spirits. Well, 4.
Yeah.
There's lots of spirits. There's lots of magic going on. I mean, it's very entertaining.
It's kind of like a Victorian Stephen King novel.
Yes. Well, even
because Stephen King, who I think is a really entertaining and great horror novelist, one of his great tells is that he always bases his horrors on it's always character-based horror in Stephen King. The supernatural, the horror, always emanates out of the flaws, the lacunas, the drives, the desires of his central protagonist. And therefore the metaphor becomes manifested in a very, one level way that can be very entertaining, whether it's specters or there's a lot of humor in A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, Dickens is trying to make a very entertaining story. I mean, he's trying to sell this story.
I think you told me that he started out as an actor.
Yes, Charles Dickens started as an actor. I feel in all of his work you can see it. He's very concerned with character. The way characters' names sound is very important to Dickens. Later on, Dickens would go on speaking tours and act and read his books.
We'll get to that in a bit, but in his own sense of what he was a commercial artist, if we're really blunt. I mean, think of it this way.
Yeah, extremely
he wrote
so.
Serialized stories. Many of his stories appeared, serialized, so he'd have to make his money month to month by whether or not people would go to the next issue. And that's why, in many ways, he's the master of the cliffhanger. It less so in the short stories, so they have great cliffhangers. But if you read anything like Copperfield, Barnaby Rudge, any of the stuff that started out in serialization form, it all works kind of like a television episode, where you're brought to that point of, how is our hero going to get out of this problem? And it's interesting because there is in this particular short story of Dickens, it seems almost much more seamless in the transitions. There really are no cliffhangers. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
this leads right to the next.
Well, this was originally written just as one book. That's how he released it. This wasn't one of his serialized novels.
Right, but because it is that way, the experience is it's not written to the cliffhanger. You know what I'm saying? There is no moment of peril that makes you go, how is our lovely Scrooge going to get out of this? Well, instead, it becomes much more of a cleaner ride.
Well, it's one of the things that makes it so great. It's there's no fluff. It's so efficient. The story is there's nothing extraneous in this story.
There's very little melodrama. All things considered, it's what you're really getting in the past and the present and the future are really that glimpses. You're never getting a full story. You're not getting a full crisis. The crisis is the totality of all of the scenes as opposed to any particular moment in time. And that is a very modernist approach. So the cynic in me, Randall, just wants to say that you got a 31-year-old man with 5 kids, another kid on the way. He is got trouble with his publisher. They're going to cut the money that he's going to give. He is writing a real quickie to cash in on the popularity of Christmas, to cash in on the popularity of ghost stories. He's going to write something that is pretty much just going to appeal to everyone's emotional sensibility, educational sensibility, the moral sensibility, their need for a good haunting tale, and he knows that because this is not going to be in a magazine, he's aiming it for a slightly more upscale crowd. So, when the book comes out, it's going to be the equivalent of like a $25 hardcover. So he knows he's not writing it for poor people. He also has a weird deal where he's only going to make money on the back end, no advance. So he's trying to make about £1,000 off of it so that he can pay off some bills and debt. So it's just a money grab. Or we can look at this as literature. And the difference, as I used to have my Slavic studies teacher say when he was quoting one of the famous Russian 19th century writers, the difference between good writing and great writing is that good writing shows us how we live, and literature shows us how we should live. So if this is a work of art, if this is literature, then instead of playing to affirming our own values and our own indulgences, Dickens is actually advocating for something. And if so, what is Dickens saying? And I honestly think that I do think you can read this as literature, and I do think you can see this as a social critique and not as entertainment. The most biting line, I think, in the entire story, where I really feel like you really hear the voice of Dickens, of Dickens and his critique of society, is this. It happens around the very end of the evening with the Ghost of Christmas Present, when he reveals under his giant robe two small children who are very malnourished, and again, you're really hitting, by the way, on a common theme with Dickens, which is the mistreatment of children as being emblematic of society's great ills, and having personal experience. But anyway, Scrooge is startled, and he said, "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. And he replies, "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them. "And they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that which is written is doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out its hands towards the city. "Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your facetious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" And of course, those last two lines were the lines that are facetiously held out by Scrooge at the beginning of the story when he turns down giving money to the charity. And I really do think in those lines about ignorance and want is the heart of the attack. How do you feel, Randall?
Well, yes, you're right. I think there's a lot going on in this story. I think there's so many different layers of meaning. And
Well, let's deal with that just particular accusation. I think that Scrooge is the embodiment of ignorance and want, privation and self-delusion. He considers himself a worldly man, and he considers himself a wealthy man, but we see while he is a miser, he lives almost in abject poverty, a very sparse life with very little does he give himself. And he has no family, no loved one, no children, very weak, sparse home. And he considers himself so clever in his retort. But, if nothing else, this whole story is about the consciousness elevation of Ebenezer Scrooge, who thinks that he knows so much and realizes only he knows nothing. But my question to you is, can that critique that Dickens is making of Scrooge be applied to not just Scrooge, but to the people of England?
well, yes, of course. I think that's pretty obvious in the story. Scrooge, Charles Dickens' attitude towards uh, the classes in England that aren't starving on the street. It is their job to make sure there's no people starving on the street. And Dickens, of course, isn't the only one that feels this way. I mean, today, most major cities, you don't see people starving on the street
Yeah, but
anymore.
is that the point of the book? Is that really what Dickens is trying to say? Is Dickens some great socialist?
Well, I don't think he is. I mean,
Well,
he.
you're in good company because neither did George Orwell. George Orwell writes. It has more to do with it was in relationship to hard times. It's an essay Orwell wrote. We'll give you a link to it, but it really sums up, I think, everything about Dickens, even in this book, which is there is not. He's talking about hard times, which is a similar book. There is not a line in the book that can properly be called socialistic. Indeed, it's a tendency, if anything, is pro-capitalistic because its whole morale is that capitalists ought to be kind, not that workers ought to be rebellious. And I think it's a key distinction when you read this book that I don't think Dickens is calling for a class overall. He opposed trade unions. It's somewhere in between, isn't it?
Well, yeah, Dickens is completely a moderate. He doesn't seem to believe in changing laws. He believes that people need to change their heart, and the more fortunate need to be kinder to the less fortunate. I mean, that's his solution. I see the logic of it. I mean, you can change the law all you want, but if people's heart isn't in it, they will subvert the law. I mean, you need both. You need law and you need true desire to help people.
It's a very I find it very problematic for a number of reasons. Because you know, well, the most problematic way to read A Christmas Carol, and it's one that I've struggled with for years, is you can look at it from one angle and consider it to be an anti-Semitic tract. That there's so many ways of looking at it as an anti-Semitic work. First off, Dickens himself did struggle with anti-Semitism. He did have characters like Fagin, who were Jews and who were evil, and he even used the word Jude as to score a better deal. And Ebenezer is an Old Testament word. It means stone of help. So in that sense, you could almost argue that it's being used ironically. In fact, for that matter, Jacob, it means supplanter. Before, of course, Jacob in the Old Testament changes his name to Israel, which is one who wrestles with angels. And keep in mind that one of the many jobs Scrooge has is he is a moneylender. And he has the pointy nose, as he's described, which is, again, one of those things in that period in history we associate with anti-Semitic figures of Jews, the pointy nose. Yes, I'm very sensitive to this because I myself am Jewish, despite my name. My parents named me Chris. That's a whole other episode. But the idea that Jews inherently, we don't celebrate Christmas. Christmas is not part of our culture. We don't go around saying Merry Christmas. You could easily argue that his lack of reverence for Christmas almost singles out the Jews. Now, I have done a lot of research into this, and I have had a conversion, so to speak, much in the same way that I have had my come to Jesus moment, which is that there's some pretty good writing in the Forward, which is a Jewish magazine, that first off, Dickens himself didn't know Hebrew. Old Testament names were very common. Yes, Scrooge is a moneylender, which is almost always associated with the worst qualities of Jews, like a Shylock. But Scrooge also has a warehouse, which means that he has other things besides money in his house. He does trades on an exchange, which would be unlikely for a Jewish businessman in that period of history. So it's more that there is an ambiguous. He's like in every kind of business. Scrooge is a businessman, is like a businessman on a TV show. Like they always work in an office, but you don't really know what they do. And I think Dickens is being deliberately ambiguous with Scrooge's line of work because he just wants to encompass as much business as possible. Also, as far as the pointy nose goes, yeah, you could read it that way, or you could just read it that he has a pointy nose because you want to make him look just pinched. But the real thing is, and why I know that it isn't really so, besides the fact that he himself has written quite a bit about why he considers himself to be a friend of Jews and eventually would write a positive Jewish character, is because the book itself is just not overtly Christian. There is almost, very, not in the movies, folks, but when you read the book, Randall, you really don't encounter Jesus or the Lord or God or anything from the Bible.
It's interesting.
Se.
It's interesting. Some of the adaptations do try to bring Christianity into the story, and it's completely unnecessary. It doesn't add anything to the story.
No, and Dickens himself was not a very Christian man. Yes, no. He was raised a Christian, but he had very little to say about it, and certainly far less to say about the church, which leads to an actually very interesting thing, which is, in some sense, the things that he struggles with are very much a part of Jewish culture. The idea of family, community, giving back to your community. These are deep within the Jewish religion. It's probably why a lot of Jewish people I have known have produced plays of A Christmas Carol, have directed A Christmas Carol. One of the biggest fans of Charles Dickens was Sigmund Freud, who would give copies of David Copperfield to women that he was trying to seduce. Now, again, we all know that Dickens held some views about Jews that were disparaging, some of which he would correct in later editions of his works. But it's fascinating, too, because it's my other theory about this work, which is, obviously, because this was written before psychoanalysis, you can't say that Dickens wrote from a psychological model, but because Freud himself looked at cultural artifacts and stories to form his psychoanalytical theories. Freud could certainly look at Dickens and the story as a psychological work, especially when you see how much of Dickens's own childhood informs the shaping of the story. As I said before, his father landed in debtor's prison. At a very early age, he had to work. His life was disrupted. The scene where the maid and the undertaker and the other lady are selling off his valuables once he's dead, what Scrooge had to do as a young boy is take the family valuables to a pawnbroker once a week to sell off whatever they could for money. That is drawn from his experience. Did you know that even the scene with Jacob Marley in chains, he gets the image of a man in chains from his 1842 visit to the United States when he is going to a prison? I don't know why, but he goes to a prison in Pittsburgh and he sees prisoners fettered in chains, and this falls upon his psyche. And one could certainly argue, especially because there's so much in looking. I mean, look, like any good analyst, the story of Scrooge begins in his past. We look to his past. We look to his relationship to his father. His father basically disowns him and blames him for the death of his mother.
Yeah, what's striking about A Christmas Carol is Scrooge is being psychoanalyzed before there's psychoanalysis.
Well, that's because Freud is looking to works of art and culture to draw his theories of psychoanalysis. So yes, his father dies, blames him. The woman he loves leaves him because she thinks his priorities are, because she says what, he's afraid. What's that line?
He fears the world too much. And, right. And Scrooge replies, there's nothing so hard as poverty.
Right, which is something that it's not entirely sure, since he can go to boarding school, that Scrooge experiences poverty in his own life as much as Dickens experiences poverty in his own life. And then Dickens resents Fred because he blames, because his sister Fanny dies in childbirth because of Fred. By the way, Fanny is based on Dickens's own real sister, Fanny. And Tiny Tim is based on one of Fanny's children who actually really had crutches. So again, he is drawing from his own life. And then, like any good psychological fear, there's a question of, if I go down this path any further, where will I end up? I read one person who diagnosed Scrooge as actually suffering from acute depression, which is why he feels so detached, why he does not even eat much food, why he is so cynical in his outlook. And I think it's just all there.
It's an amazing work, and the only strange thing to me is how little it's discussed.
Yeah, and I think let's talk a little bit about the cultural impact of the book now. In early 1884, the Gentleman's Magazine, that's what it's called, attributed the rise of charitable giving in Britain to Dickens' novella. In 1874, Robert Louis Stevenson offered a reading of Dickens' Christmas books and vowed to give generously to those in need. Thomas Carlyle expressed a generous hospitality by hosting 2 Christmas dinners after reading the book. In 1867, an American businessman was so moved by attending a reading that he closed his factory on Christmas Day and sent every employee a turkey. Oh my God, do you realize I overlooked this? And this is so important. In 1843, do you know how many people got the day off for Christmas with pay in England?
How many?
Not a lot. Very few. Very few people did. And if they did, they were solidly middle class. And yet here, this is something that Ebenezer Scrooge has actually been doing for a while. Think about it. As miserly as Ebenezer Scrooge is, at least unlike the majority of people who are bosses in 1843 England, at least he has the decency consistently, begrudgingly, but consistently, to give him a paid day off. And to think that in America, you have to wait almost over 20 years for someone to go, oh, you know what? That might be a good idea to do in general in a factory.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas gifts were originally not even given out as gifts until January 1st. Originally, New Year's Day was when people would give gifts. By this point in England, by the end of the 19th century, not only do people get Christmas Day off, they get December 26th off. You know that it's called Boxing Day. And on Boxing Day, you take all the gifts, you take all the things you have that you used to have, and you give it to the less fortunate. I mean, what a radical notion that when this book first comes out, no one expects any kind of charity of that nature. And by the end of the 19th century, that just becomes the standard in England.
Well, maybe I could talk about now the interesting... that brings to mind to me the interesting association this story has with postmodernism and just the impact the Industrial Revolution has on England. People are really reeling at the time, and they don't know where they're going to go. There's so much poverty, there's so much misery and suffering. People are looking to past traditions. And you see this pattern over and over throughout world history after the Industrial Revolution. Scrooge himself seems to me to be a very modern character. Like he's the epitome of modern man. His logic is the logic of the machine. He's hyper efficient. He only wants to do one thing, which is make money, and his whole life is devoted to making money. He's pushed away all human relationships because they don't make any money for him. What does it say about Christmas? Christmas doesn't earn him a penny. It's another day with no penny earned. And he learns in the story to go back to a primordial time. These spirits appear. Spirits, and where do spirits come from? They come from man's primordial past, a pre-industrial past, a pre-civilization past. and they bring him back to his to encounter his true essence. So
That's a very moving way of looking at it. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. I was just go on.
oh well, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I mean, and you know, I totally get that feeling from this story, especially like after looking at all the adaptations.
Well, we'll
Scrooge,
get to that in the next episode.
right? We'll get
Go
to
on.
that soon, but yeah, Scrooge is just he is. So we talked about modernism versus postmodernism in an earlier episode, and I see this story as, you know, I don't think Dickens intended it, but I think this story, like all good art, it is grown beyond the artist, and Scrooge, Scrooge, Dickens has created a story where we are, how do I express this, Chris? Scrooge has become, he's gone beyond logic. He's gone beyond logic, Chris, to become.
Well, I go ahead.
He's gone beyond logic to become a person who's reconnected with something that's inexpressible.
Absolutely, and I want to kind of look. I think the most common themes when we talk about Scrooge are greed, love, isolation, compassion, and redemption, and they're all there. But we've given a lot of time to Dickens's feelings on the matter, but I think it's fair to look at it now through our own eyes personally. And you know, our relationship with the work changes by our relationship in time, right? I mean, what was when you look? If you're listening to this, more than likely your first encounter of A Christmas Carol was as a child. Maybe you saw the movie, maybe you went to a school pageant, whatever. Your first encounter is through the eyes of a child, on the level almost of a Tiny Tim. So when you were a kid, what was your impression of the story? What was your impression?
Well, my first impression as a kid was that the message of the story was to tell you to stop and smell the flowers along the way, to remember to have fun in life, so you don't become a miserable old man.
Okay. When I was a kid, this story scared the bejesus out of me because as a small child, ghosts scared me. And Scrooge himself seemed ghost-like and feral, and he seemed like every other old person who scared me with their decrepit, decayed anger and rage. And I always thought, like, well, I better not keep that extra bubble gum. I better give that to my friend. I better spend some money on my mother and my sister. I better, you know, like it's that child's feeling that authority is telling you, you better be generous or you will pay. You know, it's a strong moral homily to a child. And part of that is because after the Victorian era, in the Edwardian era, it did go from being a story for adults to being a story for children. And it was used very much to tell children this is a form of behavior. And then, you know, in college, I think that's when I really got into Dickens mostly. I was in English. I majored in both government and English. So I love Dickens. So that was my big affair with being into Dickens and watching the films. And I think at that point, you know, there's a point where you find yourself in Fred's position. You know what I'm saying? A little smarter, a little calmer. You got your life going. I mean, technically speaking, Dickens is around the same age as Fred. Or maybe, have you ever felt like Bob Cratchit working for a Scrooge?
Well, of course.
We've all been Bob Cratchit working for a Scrooge, right? I can't tell you, especially how many times I've had to ask for vacation time because my family's in New York and I got a job in LA, and I get, you want me to give you paid vacation? No, I just want to be able to take off. Well, you know, it's the holidays, Chris. You work in retail. You know, like you know, it's very funny, in fact, how perverse. But now I have found myself at, you know, I looked it up, and Ebenezer Scrooge would be between your age and my age. He'd be about 50, a few years younger than you. And sorry, a few years older than you and a few years younger than me. And it seems to me, especially the way the story is written, and Dickens is so prescient because he is only a 31-year-old man, that he really understands the middle-aged man's dilemma. This is a great story about a man having a midlife crisis, because when you get to be the age that you are or I am, I think you do want to look back and go, how did I get to this place? Is this really where I want to be in my life? And the greatest fear, which is, where's my life heading? And we all, at the point of our lives right now, you can call it a halfway mark or not, but we're all living, you and I, in that same zone that Ebenezer's living in. We're all that guy who's like, well, look at my childhood, look at the past opportunities I had. How am I living the life I should be living? Am I a member of my own community? Am I my best self? Am I going to end up in a horrible, decaying old age alone?
Well,
I'm not trying to overread it, because obviously,
I don't think you are. But see, that
house is doing very well.
Yeah, well, I don't think you are. See, that's what the magic of this story, and that's why this story is so popular. I mean, there's so many layers of meaning,
but you're not,
so many things going on.
I'm sorry. Let me be very clear. I'm not in his position literally, but I think you and I are both in his position spiritually. We are both now at the time in our lives where we just have to take accounting.
Sure.
And we can see, I think the thing that I find fascinating about Scrooge at this age, having reread it for the first time in years and rewatched the film for the first time in years, is how much sympathy I have for Ebenezer Scrooge. I no longer can identify with Tiny Tim. I can no longer identify with Bob Cratchit. A little bit. I certainly can't ever identify with that Fred, who's just getting more on my nerves with every year. But oh my God, how could we not at this point in our lives not feel anything but sorry for Ebenezer Scrooge?
Well, this is why I feel strongly that Scrooge is an everyman. He's all of us. He's what we all eventually feel like and become. And we're in a rut. And what do we do? How do we get out of that rut? We practically need supernatural forces to come and visit us and help us understand things.
And I think that when we think about Scrooge, I think the greed in our understanding of greed is really not the greed of a man who cheats other people. I think in our contemporary world, we think of the greed as the way that we cheat ourselves.
Well, yeah, isn't it interesting how Dickens puts the base of Scrooge's problems with being fear and not greed.
Yeah, it's fear. It's a lack of self-love, really, that he suffers from. And without his own ability to treat himself with any warmth and kindness, it becomes impossible for him to care for others. In fact, in fairness, it bothers me even in the book that he learns to be generous with others, but he never learns to be generous with himself.
That's an interesting reading. That's an interesting
story, obviously.
That's an interesting reading you have, but it's hard for me to imagine Scrooge post this story, after this story. It's hard for me to imagine Scrooge isn't generous with himself as time goes on. I mean,
one would hope so. No, I mean, I feel like if I have a criticism of the book, is that there are no real turning points. You know what I'm saying? Things happen to him as a young man, but I don't think that, he can't help it that his sister dies. He can't help it that he's sent to school. He believes in Mr. Fezziwig's generosity until someone berates it. And then I honestly think the breakup scene, I think it's a very unfair breakup scene. First off, because I don't think a Victorian woman of that era would have just broken up that way. I think she would have respected the fact that that Scrooge really is trying to earn his way in life. And he doesn't do anything sinister. He doesn't do anything dastardly. He simply, he fails to say the right words to keep her. But would a Victorian man of that era say more than he did?
Well, I don't think that's I don't think that's accurate reading. I think that she says in that scene that this is a change she's noticed in him over a long period of time. I mean, you're criticizing it for not having these pivotal moments, but this idea of pivotal moments in people's lives, I think this comes from modern cinema, where it's much easier to just visually create an exciting climatic scene where there's a turning point in someone's life. But in real life, there aren't many climatic, pivotal moments.
I would strongly disagree. I think that, yes, in modernism, but even in just literature of that period in history, even people like who are writing in the same era as Dickens, there were turning points. Even in Dickens, there are plenty of times where there are turning points in a character's career where if they make one decision, they can go in one way, and if they make another decision, in fact, turning points is what Dickens does better than anyone else.
Sure,
but
and there's a turning point. Yeah.
In this story, he is deliberately occluding those turning points because he doesn't want that to happen in his past. I think he's really trying to say that Ebenezer has not been an active participant in his own life. And maybe that's why she says what did she say? You're afraid.
She just says you fear the world too much.
Right. So then he fears to speak his heart to her. And by fearing to speak his heart to her, he loses her. And then to compound the pain and suffering, Dickens even shows Ebenezer that he loses the joy of even having a family, that she's okay, she has someone, and he could have been that person. So it is driven in harder, relentlessly so, because even Dickens doesn't cause the deaths of his sister. Dickens doesn't cause Tiny Tim to suffer, but it may be in the end of the second act, or at least certainly by the beginning of the third act, that in his journey of redemption, it's the journey of figuring out how could he affect the world? How could he take action? And maybe that's what it is that he has not lived a life of proactive behaviors, which means it's not really even a redemption. It's more a question of self-actualization. Given who I am in this moment in history, I am a wealthy employer with money, and I have an employee who has got a sick child, and I have a nephew who needs a paternalistic uncle. What riches can I afford to share with the world that I can take action on? Because I swear to you, I don't really consider him a man of action in the book until literally he wakes up at the end of the story and realizes he still has time to take any kind of action.
Well, I think that's a great reading of it, and I think that the work invites that reading. I mean, this is why, Chris, it's such a popular work, because I think almost everyone can see themselves in Scrooge, and we can see qualities in Scrooge that we all possess, and they're not negative qualities, but we can see that if we allow our fears and allow the logic of the modern world to invade our minds too much, we turn into a miser, and we shut ourselves off from other people. I mean, that's the message of that's one of the messages of the story, wouldn't you say?
I would say that there are so many there's so many things going on in this little short story. Yes. And you point to the deliberate ambiguity that you can find in this work much more than traditional works of Dickens. There is a lot of room to decide, is this a story of redemption? Is this a story of self-actualization? Is this a story of Christianity, socialism, modernism, Victorianism, Edwardianism, a Christian allegory to warn school children? There are so many ways of looking at this, and there are so many ways in which to interpret it, that when we get to the next episode, adaptations of A Christmas Carol, we're going to look at that. What is, because for many of us, it's not the story that is our first encounter or our most common encounter. It's all these adaptations. So please come back Christmas Eve, where we will talk about the adaptations of A Christmas Carol. Until then, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Happy holidays.